Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of digital fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and this is our set review for Outlaws of Thunder Junction. This video in particular is going to be going over all of the colorless cards. We've already done a video each for each of the 5 main colors. If you've checked those out already, I appreciate you sticking around and checking out all the videos. If you haven't yet, I'm going to link those in the description. Make sure to check those out because there's a lot of valuable insights in there. We evaluate all of the cards, mostly the commons and uncommons for limited, and the rares and the mythics for constructed. So check that stuff out if you're interested. A lot of cool ideas brewing around in the old brain here. So some really cool stuff to be seen in those videos. But before we get into this video, really quick, hit the like button. Do me a favor. It helps this video get out to so many more people, and I really need the help. So thank you so much if you've done that. Also subscribe if you're new, if you find any value in this video, because I have a ton of content on the way, a bunch of deck techs. We're going to hit the ground running as soon as the new set launches on Arena. Tons of stuff coming. So with all of that out of the way, let's get on to the cards. First up, we have the cycle of common dual lands. There is one for every single color combination. The example I'm showing here is Abraded Bluffs. So they are all deserts. They all enter the battlefield tapped. Tap for a mana of one of up to 2 colors. So in this case, it's a Boros land. It taps for red or white. And then when it enters the battlefield, it also deals 1 damage to target opponent, which is kind of cool. I really like these. I think these are some of the better common mana fixing lands that we've got in quite a while. And they can be kind of useful. One thing that I'm thinking about using this for in Standard in particular is maybe some kind of a self-mill deck that puts a bunch of lands into the graveyard with a whole bunch of these, and then you can play something that pulls all your lands out of the graveyard and maybe just like one-hit your opponent with just ping damage from lands. I know it seems a little cute, and it's probably not good enough at the end of the day, but I still want to try it and see if we can make it work, so that's kind of interesting. But in Limited, these are going to be really easy ways to just fix your mana, basically start your opponent at 19 life, right? And really help you play multicolors in your deck. So these are going to be key to grab. Make sure you prioritize them as they're going around the table, especially if you have a 3rd splash color. It's going to be important to get your hands on a few of these in Limited. Next up, we have Arid Archway, another desert. When it enters the battlefield, it enters tapped, and you have to return a land you control to its owner's hand. If another desert was returned this way, you get to surveil one, and then this taps for 2 colorless mana. 2 colorless mana is a lot. Now, entering the battlefield is not good, but it can come into play untapped if you're playing something like Spelunking, right? So seems like it might be pretty good in that. It's almost like a Soul Ring at that point if it comes in untapped with Spelunking, so that could be kind of cool. And even though returning a land you control to your hand is going to be a downside most of the time, there are ways to play this in a deck where you can turn that into an upside. If you're playing anything where landfall matters and you get to put something back in your hand that you can replay, re-trigger a landfall ability when otherwise you might be out of mana to play and you might miss your land drop for the turn, you could do stuff like that. And it's cool that if you return a desert, you get to surveil one. You get this little bit of extra value, which is going to be more meaningful in Limited because you have just a 40 card deck, not a 60, so you're that much closer to your bombs as it is. And every time you surveil one, you're going to get 1 turn closer to your bomb, which is going to help you just win the game, right? So that little bit of surveil too is some nice little bit of extra value, but a land that taps for 2 mana is, you at least have to take notice and keep it in the back of your mind, because the potential to make that way too good if it ends up in just the right deck is there. And it's kind of crazy. So I'm wondering if there's really a deck that can abuse the heck out of this. If you can think of any ideas, let me know in a comment down below. But we're going to move on to Bandits Hall. This is 3 mana for an artifact. Whenever you commit a crime, you put a loot counter on it, but this ability only triggers once a turn, which is kind of a bummer. It taps for a mana of any color, just full stop, so you don't need the loot counters in order to get a mana of any color. This can just be a 3 mana rock that fixes you and ramps you, which is kind of cool. but then it also has this last ability where you can pay 2, tap it, remove 2 loot counters from it, and draw a card. So in Limited, this is going to be great because it's going to come down and not only ramp you, but like I said, it's going to fix you, and it's going to over time build up some value so that you can draw some extra cards and hopefully outvalue your opponent, have more board presence than them through sheer card advantage. So I think this is pretty good because it kind of does all the things you want to do in Limited. So I think you could probably safely pick this relatively high, not like a first pick or anything, but it's gonna be an important card, especially if you're not playing base green and you want to play a 3-color deck without green. This is going to be really important as one of your mana fixers to help you make that happen, because you're not going to have that extra fixing that comes with playing green. Next up, we have a cycle of fast lands. Now these are all of the enemy colored fast lands that we don't have in standard yet. They're finally going to be in standard. So we've got Golgari 1 here. The other 4 are coming as well in this set. These lands are awesome. We've been waiting a long time for this. Tempted to give this like a best card award, but I don't think it's right to hand that out to lands, especially when it's just completing a cycle of lands that we already have in the format, right? So I'm going to hold off on giving this an award, but please understand that these are good enough that they're good enough to deserve an award as far as like best colorless card, because these are going to be super important. Some of these are color combinations that aggro is pretty impressive in, specifically Boros. The Boros combo deck that's everywhere in the standard meta right now is going to be able to use the Boros fast land to great effect. So being able to finally get these fast lands, a way to make 2 different colors of mana untapped early in the game as you're curving out, is going to be really important for aggro decks that are multicolor, and some decks that otherwise were just a little bit off the mark and couldn't quite be fast enough to exist, now will get the opportunity to exist and be as fast as they need to be to compete with other aggro decks. So these lands are really important. They're probably the first things you're going to want to craft, honestly, for your constructed decks, because I think they're going to be that important. Moving on, we've got Boombox, 2 mana for an artifact. You can pay 6, tap it, and sacrifice it to destroy up to 1 artifact, 1 creature, and 1 land. This thing is kind of wild. Now, granted, it's a lot of mana to use, right? 6 is a lot, but there are some really interesting things that you can line up with this card to make it even better. There is a mythic in this set that allows you to make token copies of things that you sacrifice for an extra 2 mana. So if you can just make enough mana, you can keep sacking Boombox to destroy the best artifact, the best creature, and one of their lands that they don't get to replace with a basic like most land removal does these days. And then just get another copy of Boombox and just keep doing it every turn. You could do some pretty wild stuff with that. So it's even possible to get that in draft. If you end up, you know, pack 1, pick 1ing that mythic, and then a Boombox comes around, keep it in mind, because that could be a really crazy thing that you could set up in Limited that would be pretty wild, to be completely honest. So kind of cool card here. It is gonna be a little too expensive for most decks, but certain decks, ramp decks, can make good use of it, especially if they're a little light on removal and they need to shore that up within the deck. And like I said, if you can get that kind of combo online, it's probably also worth playing this. So pretty interesting card. Makes me wonder if we can make a land destruction deck in standard. Probably too expensive, but the potential is there, and that's just really enticing. Maybe we'll try it at some point. Next up, we've got Bucolic Ranch, and this is actually my pick for sleeper card in colorless for this set, and there's a good reason for that. So this is a desert that comes into play untapped, taps for a colorless, which is fine, but it can also tap for a mana of any color, but you can only use that mana to cast a mount spell. Mounts are going to be powerful. I think they are very underestimated right now, but I have specifically a mount deck in mind, a 4 or maybe 5 color mount deck that just goes super deep into mount and uses roaming thrones to get double or sometimes triple the attack triggers from our mounts being saddled. And it's important to note that a mount can saddle another mount if you need to, which is really cool. So if you have a board of a bunch of mounts, you can kind of pick and choose which of them are going to saddle which other of them, so that you can get whichever abilities are best for you in that specific turn, which is kind of interesting. So I do think this is going to be super, super important in a deck like that. But also, that, as if that wasn't enough, you can pay 3 and tap this and look at the top card of your library. If it's a mount, you can reveal it and put it into your hand. So you have a nice little bit of a mana sink here if you're out of gas, where you can maybe even just draw a mount without wasting a card, without actually spending a card in your hand. And that's just really good extra gravy on a land you're probably already going to want to play if you're super deep into mount tribals. So even though that deck is a little niche, and I don't think there's a lot of decks that will want to run this Bucolic Ranch, I think that deck's actually going to be really good, and I think Bucolic Ranch, along with the other tribal lands, are going to be a huge, huge part of making that deck work with 4+ colors. So this is my pick for Sleeper. I think it's going to be awesome. I plan on using it day one for sure. Next up, we've got Conduit Pylons. This is another colorless land. It's a desert. When it enters the battlefield, you get to surveil one. It doesn't enter tapped. So you surveil one and get an untapped land. Now granted, it taps for a colorless, but also if you're desperate, you can use it as a filter land. Tap 1 mana and it to add a mana of any color. So I think this is actually pretty decent fixing, especially in a deck like that's not running base green. I'm probably going to say that a lot for like pretty much anything that is fixing within colorless, so expect to hear that a lot, but it's pretty good fixing for anything that's not base green. It's a way for you to play 3 colors without playing green and still make it work. So keep that in mind. It could be really important to enable that. It also counts as a desert, so it's going to work with any kind of desert synergies you have within the deck. Next up, we've got Fomori Vault, and I was very, very close to making this one of the top cards in colorless for the set. It has a lot of potential, but I just think there are a couple cards that are better than it. So this is a land that taps for a colorless mana. It is not a desert, unfortunately, but you can pay 3 mana, tap it, discard a card, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of artifacts you control, put one of those cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So if you don't have a problem making a bunch of mana and you're going super wide with artifacts, this is just a tutor every turn. You just dump your extra 3 mana into this, tutor up pretty much whatever you need. You only need to go so wide with artifacts before that X is big enough that it might as well say just search your deck, right? So if it's the right deck where you're wide enough with artifacts and you have the mana to spare, this could be insane. Older formats, I think, are going to be able to make much better use of this because they have so many more broken ways of making tons of mana and going really wide with artifacts. But there is potential for this to even pop up in Standard, which is kind of interesting. So we'll have to see. Do you have an idea for a Standard deck that could actually make use of the Vault? Let me know in a comment, because obviously it's going to be pretty good in certain older formats, but in Standard, I think we're going to have to work to really make it worth it. Next up, we've got Gold Pan. This is 2 mana for an artifact equipment. When it enters, you get to create a treasure token. So it's already going to ramp you and fix you, which is going to be good, again, for 3 color decks that aren't including green. And then you can just equip it for 1 mana, and it gives anything +1/+1. Having an equipment that just buffs a guy by +1/+1 for only 1 mana is kind of good. I like the 1 mana equip, I'm not going to lie. Normally, it's just not worth an entire card, right? But the fact that this ramps you and fixes you as well helps you play your big bomb a turn early, helps you play your splash color piece of removal or whatever when you otherwise couldn't, and then leaves behind some value that you can just make one of your creatures that much better, and if they deal with it, you just equip it to something else. So I kind of like this. Again, you're probably only going to prioritize it if you really need the fixing, if you're in a deck that's using 3 colors and one of those colors isn't green, and you're getting, you know, a little bit later into the draft and coming up short on fixing, you could pick one of these up somewhat late in the draft and probably slot it in and help you shore up that issue. So keep that in mind. Not a super high pick, but gonna be useful in those multicolor decks that don't have green. Next up, we've got Lava Spur Boots. This is actually my pick for my favorite card in colorless in this set. This is an artifact equipment for just 1 mana. It equips for just 1 mana. It gives +1/+0, haste, and ward 1. Now, ward 1 is nice gravy. +1/+0, even better gravy. But the real thing that makes this card so awesome is the haste. Being able to give any creature you just played haste for just an extra mana, being able to do that every single turn for only equip 1 is going to be really, really strong, both in limited and in certain constructed decks, especially if you're playing a deck that cares about going really wide with artifacts, where this is just going to count as another artifact on the field for very, very cheap. You can get even more value off the boots, but again, just equipping for 1 every time you play a creature so that that thing gains haste. And what's cool too is you don't get only the haste for that 1, you're also getting an extra point of damage and the ward 1. So I feel like it's just a lot for just 1 mana, you know? It's not Lightning Greaves. It's not as good as Lightning Greaves, but it's probably the closest we're gonna get in quite a while, and for a while, ever maybe. I think it's good. Haste for 1 mana with 2 different pieces of upside value on it is just really good. I don't know. I can't quite put it into words, but I just love this card, and I really think it's going to perform way better in practice than people are thinking it's going to do when they look at it, you know, on first inspection. So, moving on, this is Lost Jitte, and this is actually my pick for the best colorless card. Now, when you first read this card, it just seems like a not as good version of Umezawa's Jitte, which it kind of is that, right? It kind of is a not as good version, but I think it's easy to get hung up on that detail and not see all of the value that still is here. It does only cost 1 mana to play. It equips for only 1 mana. When you deal combat damage, you put a charge counter on it. Now, the equipped creature doesn't have to deal combat damage to the opponent to get a charge counter, just any combat damage. Even if you trade your creature in combat with another creature and the creature dies, the Jitte still gets a charge counter, which is awesome. And you don't need to have the Jitte equipped in order to use those charge counters to get value. At any time, you can remove a charge counter to choose one, either untap a land, make it so target creature can't block this turn, or put a +1/+1 counter on equipped creature. So you can build up counters over time, and then eventually either just make it so all their creatures can't block all at once for an alpha strike, which could be insane, or you could just take, you know, 2 or 3 counters and untap 2 or 3 lands and play out like an Atali when you only have like 4 lands on the field and you're playing it out way quicker than you otherwise would, or any other big bomb. Atali's just an example, but you know, you can use that untap a land with multiple charge counters to basically ramp you into some kind of big crazy threat. And even if you're not saving up the counters over time and you're forced to kind of use them relatively quickly each turn, you can do things like put counters on your creatures. You can swing in with a Jitte that has 2 or 3 charge counters on it, and they're going to be worried about blocking because you could just remove however many you need to make your creature big enough that it survives combat and kills their guy that they blocked with. Because of that, they're going to be really scared. You don't even need to spend any mana to do it, right? You just remove charge counters, so the threat of activation there is kind of crazy, but then also the long-term value, the long-term threat of being able to potentially ramp into stuff or just make their entire field not be able to block for a turn could be crazy. You got to remember, you can just save up charge counters and then just dump them all at once for insane value, while still threatening to remove counters each turn and not actually doing it. But that threat of activation just helps you get in and helps you do things you otherwise might not have been able to do. And even if your creature dies, it just equips for 1 mana. Just 1 mana, it's on something else, it can start to get counters again. If you have First Strike, you can hit and get a counter before their creatures do damage, and then maybe use those counters to kind of blow them out in the middle of combat. And Double Strike makes it even crazier because you hit twice in one combat and get 2 charge counters, the first of which could theoretically be used to buff up the creature before it does damage again with normal combat damage. So just a lot of different ways you can make this work super well for you, and I just think it's very overlooked how good it's going to be, and I think it's just going to be nuts. It's kind of overshadowed right now just by how good Umezawa's Jitte was, and I think people are comparing it a little too much, but when you look at where Standard's at right now and the power level and how much this card can bring to the table, I think this card is just kind of bananas. So if you disagree, let me know in the comments. But also let me know what decks you think this would actually be best in, like what you want to use it in, because it can kind of go in anything, but I'm sure there's got to be specific decks out there where it's going to be even better, right? So let me know. Moving on, we've got Lotus Ring. This really wants to win an award, but it will not. 3 mana for an artifact equipment. It is indestructible, kind of reminds me of the One Ring. It equips for a whopping 3 mana, but it gives the equipped creature +3/+3 and vigilance and the ability to tap and sack the creature to add 3 mana of any one color. What's cool about this card is even though the equip cost is 3, you can sacrifice the creature to get the 3 mana back. So in a way, it almost feels like equip is 0 as long as you're willing to sacrifice the creature after combat. And because of the vigilance, you can actually do that. So you can equip this, swing in with a much beefier creature, and then second main phase, sack it, get your mana back, not only get it back, but turn it into any color you need, and then play whatever you would have played anyway. So if you have a deck that can facilitate those kinds of play lines, especially if you have something that, like, when a creature becomes sacked, you get some kind of value. Maybe you're playing this with an Oni Cult Anvil, so then in second main, when you sack the creature you attacked with, it's going to trigger the Anvil and give you another creature to replace it. Stuff like that could get really cool. Also, ways to give your creatures haste could make this even more valuable, right? And I'm sure there's some busted combos you can probably do in older formats, but that well is so deep that I don't even want to think about it right now. So if you've got ideas of how to use this in completely busted ways in older formats, definitely let me know in a comment. But I think the card is fine. I think it's good. I don't think it's amazing. I think the fact that it's a Lotus anything makes it seem like it's a little bit better than it is, but it's also not nothing. A lot of competitive Spike style players feel like have been talking like this is complete junk. Definitely not complete junk. Being able to buff your guy that big and swing in and then just get your mana back, you know, post combat second main phase could be pretty good. So I don't know, we'll see. Next up, we've got Luxurious Locomotive, and this is my pick for the best limited card in colorless. I think this card is bananas, and there's one specific reason why, and I'm going to have to point out there's a lot of misunderstandings about how this card can be used. I'm going to have to point that out in a second. So this is a 6/5 artifact vehicle for 5 mana. When it attacks, you create a treasure token for each creature that crewed it this turn. It crews for just 1, so you can tap any creature, any number of creatures you control with total power 1 or more, to turn it into a creature until end of turn, but you can only activate that once each turn. Now, people read that last line and they confuse that with, well, I can only crew it with 1 creature. No. You can only do 1 crew activation, and then you can't do it anymore the rest of the turn. But that 1 crew activation consists of tapping any number of creatures you want. So you can tap 7 creatures to crew this if you want, so that when it swings, you get 7 treasure tokens, which is insane. It's just you have to commit those 7 creatures to crewing it all at the same time. You can't crew a couple now, and then crew a couple more later, and then wait and crew a couple more later. You know, you can't use it multiple times in a turn. I don't know why you'd want to. Maybe there's some way you can dodge removal or get around your opponent's tricks or something like that. I'm not sure. But obviously they decided that it needed to be how whatever creatures you were going to crew it with needed to be decided all at once. There must have been something broken you could do otherwise, right? If you could think of anything that could have been broken if that line of text wasn't there, let me know in a comment, because I'm coming up kind of blank, but I assure you, when you do that one crew activation that you are allowed per turn, that one crew activation can consist of tapping any number of creatures you want. It even says so in the reminder text. And if you could only just tap the one creature, it would kind of be a pointless ability, and it would be very pointless to be worded in a way that for each creature that crewed it, you make a treasure token if you were literally never allowed to crew it with more than one creature. So if you really think about it, this has to be the way it works, right? And it is. But if you could think of why, let me know in a comment, because I can't think of what that line of text would be stopping. There has to be something broken that you could do otherwise. I just don't know what it is. But this is a great card for limited. It slots into literally anything because it's colorless. It's a pretty good body. It's a way to ramp and color fix an insane amount. All you have to do is just commit one turn to just tapping all of your guys to this and swinging with it. And if you can manage to like take that turn off from swinging with everything or holding back a bunch of blockers and just kind of toss away that one turn, you can get so many treasures and ramp out literally your whole hand probably the next turn. There's just, the ceiling on this is so high, but at the end of the day, it can also just be literally a 6/5 that becomes crewed by tapping any creature, even if you just use it to block and you don't care about that attack trigger ability. So a lot of value to be had here for a colorless card that can slot into anything. I think you need to jam this super high. It is not going to table, so you definitely want to grab it as soon as you see it. I think it's a high pick in limited for sure. And it'll be interesting to see if we can brew any kind of standard deck that could actually make good use of this. I almost think maybe Boros Convoke would like this because they go so wide with so many little creatures that you could make a ton of treasures. But I don't know if they want a 5-drop. I don't know if that would make sense. I don't know if the game's supposed to be over by the time they drop their 5th lands. So I'm not sure, but the potential is there. Next up, we've got Mirage Mesa. This is another colorless land. It is a desert. I lied, it is not a colorless land because when it enters the battlefield, it enters tapped and you choose a color, and then taps for a mana of the chosen color. This is really good fixing, and it's going to be important, again, not only for just fixing in general, but if you're trying to go 3 colors and splash a color, especially without green, this is another one of those cards that can help you mana fix that you can keep in mind. It will probably table. That being said, the ability to choose a mana of any color, choose it to give you mana of any color when it enters the battlefield, is pretty good. Even if it does enter tapped, I think this is actually going to be a really good land for limited. You're probably going to want to grab one, especially if you're not in green. Next up, we've got Mobile Homestead. 2 mana for a 3/3 artifact vehicle. It has haste as long as you control a mount, which is really interesting. Whenever Mobile Homestead attacks, you look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield tapped, and it crews for 2. So pretty interesting here. If you play a mount on 1, I guess? Are there any 1-drop mounts? I don't think so. But if you already have a mount on the field, you can just jam this and then crew the Mobile Homestead with the mount to swing and then ramp out a land. But you probably want to be saddling your mount and attacking with that, right? So I don't necessarily think this wants to come out on curve. I don't know. It's interesting. It's interesting. It's tricky. It has haste if you control a mount, but early in the game, if you control a mount, it might be your only creature, and do you really want to tap the mount to crew the Mobile Homestead? I like this card, but the way it lines up, I'm not sure the best way to use it, to be completely honest. If you have any ideas, let me know in the comments. This is an interesting one. I do think it's a good card, but I also think it's going to require some trial and error to figure out exactly where it fits best and what kind of playlines work best with it. interesting. Next up, we've got Nexus of Becoming. 6 mana for an artifact. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you get to draw a card. Then you may exile an artifact or creature card from your hand. If you do, you make a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 3/3 golem artifact creature in addition to its other types. This is kinda nuts. Just every turn, you get your best creature or artifact into play as a 3/3 version, but you can get the ETBs, right? So like a Traxa ETB trigger, a Tali ETB trigger on a 3/3 golem, but you didn't spend any mana, and it can just do that every turn, and you can just get insane value off of it. But not only that, you gotta remember, you also draw a card. So even though you lose whatever the body is of the creature, and instead it's a 3/3 version, you're also drawing a card to replace it. So it's almost like you're just getting a 3/3 copy of the thing for free, and it's like you never even lost a card out of your hand because you drew a card to replace the card that you exiled. So this thing's just a value engine. If you get this in limited, you just win. Granted, it's a mythic, but it'll be really interesting to see how people brew with this. It's a little expensive. That's my only worry, is you're not cheating very much into play that you're going to save an awful lot of mana on. Most of the things that you're going to want to use this with are probably 7 drops, and that's only 1 mana away from just playing this. That being said, being able to do it every turn for free, that's where the value lies. You know, your first thing that you get off of it, you're not going to really be seeing an exact return on your investment because you're only really saving probably like 1 mana or whatever. But then when it starts to give you more value turn after turn after turn, that's where things I think will snowball. So I don't know the best deck for this, but there's got to be something out there that wants to run this, right? It reminds me a little bit of Chimil. Maybe this and Chimil can go in the same deck. I don't know. All I know is this card is really good and has a lot of potential value while also drawing you a card every turn, just cuz. So, I don't know. This has to go somewhere. Let me know in the comments what you're thinking. Next up, we've got Oasis Gardener. This is a 3 mana 2/2 artifact Scarecrow. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life and it taps for a mana of any color. I almost picked this as my limited pick until I found, you know, Luxurious Locomotive. But this is pretty good, honestly. A 2/2 for 3 is not great, but you gotta remember, this is colorless. So it can slot into literally any deck and shore up what you need it to be, gaining you the 2 life to make up for a little bit of life that you've lost to an early aggro deck, and help make sure that the game drags out a little longer, is not nothing. And then being able to tap it for literally a mana of any color, with it being colorless, it's basically a mana rock that also gains you 2 life and can also be a 2/2 body, because it's the same cost as a mana rock, and it gives you a mana of any color, right? I guess the one downside is it has Summoning Sickness, so you can't get that mana the turn you play it, but it's also just a common. So I think what this guy is best at is just later on in the draft, if you really need fixing and you're coming up short, it should be pretty easy to grab a copy of this and just help have another card help you get to the fixing that you need. So it's really good as a late pick that can fulfill a certain very specific role in your deck if you're starting to get towards the end of the draft and you realize you don't have enough of that. Next up, we have Red Rock Sentinel. I almost wanted to pick this for best limited too until I realized it had Defender, and then I realized it'd be way too good without Defender, but I digress. 3 mana for a 2/4 artifact creature golem with Defender, and you can pay 2, tap, sack a land to draw a card and create a treasure token. Even having a 2/4 Defender for 3 mana on curve is pretty good, especially when it's colorless and it can literally slot into any deck. This is very defensive. It's gonna just completely put a speed bump in front of aggro, which is really nice. But then it also gives you this late game value of eventually, when you have more lands than you could ever need, you can just start sacrificing them to draw cards to dig for your bomb, while also getting a treasure token to potentially ramp you or fix you, which is really nice. It helps mitigate that loss of a land just a little bit too, because for one more turn, you're still going to effectively have the same amount of mana as if you didn't sack that land, because you get that treasure that's basically like one more use, right? So kind of an interesting card. It having Defender obviously makes it way worse once I realized that, but it's still going to be super useful in the right decks, especially if you're trying to play defensively and just aren't coming up with enough cards in your color to shore up your curve. This could be pretty effective. Again, the late game ability to get card advantage every single turn should not be overlooked, so I do think this is worth considering and grabbing if you need this kind of card to fill any holes in your deck. Next up, we've got Sandstorm Verge. This is a desert that taps for a colorless mana, or you can pay 3 mana and tap it, and target creature can't block this turn. Activate only as a sorcery. I think in Limited, this is going to be a little bit better. You know, if you start to run out of gas and just have extra mana that you don't have anything to sink it into, you can just make sure that their best creature to block with can't block every turn, right? If you just need to get through for an Alpha Strike and there's only one very effective blocker they have, you can take it out of commission. It's especially good if you've got a bunch of flyers, because if they happen to get that one flyer down and now they can block you, and all you need to do is deal with that one flyer and your flyers can start swinging in, being able to take it out of commission every turn with something like this could be really good. That being said, it only taps for a colorless mana, so it's going to be really hard to use something like this in a deck that's color intensive, and you have to kind of take that into account and keep that in mind if you're going to use it, but in just the right deck, it could be viable. Here we have Silver Deputy, 2 mana for a 1/2 artifact creature mercenary. When he enters the battlefield, you get to search your library for a basic land card or a desert card, reveal it, shuffle, and put it on top. You can also tap to give target creature you control +1/+0 at sorcery speed. So this is basically the equivalent of one of those 1/1 mercenary tokens, except it has an extra toughness, and it fetches a land and puts it on top of your library. So this is a really good way of mana fixing without losing your board presence, right? If you play a lot of the other mana fixing cards, like that's all they do, that's all you get out of the card. This is a way to not only get your fixing, set yourself up with the thing you need next turn so that you have the colors you need, but also put some board presence on the board and give you something to apply more pressure to the opponent, or to get them to maybe reconsider attacking you, that kind of thing. So I like that we can have a halfway decent body tacked on to our ability to mana fix, all in the same card, without a card just being completely 100% devoted to fixing. So I think this is one of the better options for fixing in Limited because of that. So keep that in mind, and if you need to fix, this guy should probably be at the top of the list. Maybe not ahead of some of the better like green fixing and stuff like that, but I think he's pretty good. Here we have Sterling Hound. This is 3 mana for a 3/2 artifact creature dog. When he enters the battlefield, you surveil 2. It's fine. This is going to be a nice curve filler if you're low on 3-drops, right? 3 power 3-drop that can trade with stuff that can go in any color deck, but is also going to surveil to dig 2 turns, 2 cards closer to your bomb when it enters the battlefield. Not too shabby. We're going to move on. This is Sword of Wealth and Power, and this is actually my pick for runner-up, the second best card in colorless for the set. It was really a toss-up between this and Jitte. I wasn't sure which one is actually best, but I think at the end of the day, the Jitte wins out. This card is still incredibly powerful. It's an artifact equipment for 3 mana, and it equips for 2, so it is a little bit expensive to finally get it going. But the equipped creature gets +2/+2 and protection from instants and from sorceries. Now, protection from instants and from sorceries means no instant or sorcery removal can be used to kill the creature, which is huge. In some instances, that's going to be way better than getting protection from a color. Now, sure, there's still some removal that's going to be able to hit your creature that has this equipped, right? Enchantments that exile something when they enter the battlefield, or creatures that kill things with an ETB, that kind of stuff. But those are edge cases, right? The vast majority of removal that that are most efficient that people are running are gonna be instants and sorceries, and they just literally can't target whatever creature has this equipped at all. So I think that in and of itself is amazing. Like, sure, you don't get the ability to be unblocked by creatures of 2 different colors like the old swords used to do with their protection from 2 different colors, right? But I think it's worth it to give that up, being able to have protection from all instants and sorceries from all 5 colors. So I just think that's great. But then you go to the other abilities here. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you create a treasure token, and when you next cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn, you get to copy it. That seems crazy too. If you can make sure your opponent has a very difficult time killing your guy, so that it survives, so that it can swing in and trigger this other ability, not only can you cast any instant or sorcery and get a copy of it, but you actually get a treasure token to help you. I don't even want to think what this would do if Invoke Despair was still legal in Standard, because that is terrifying. But there are plenty of big hit, expensive, really good instants and sorceries that getting 2 of with this would be absolutely insane. Rush of Dread is one possibility, which makes you lose half your life. So copying that would be pretty crazy. And the treasure token helps you play something more expensive than you otherwise would be able to play, right? It ramps you. Even if you don't play something super expensive the first time you swing, you could save the treasure token, play something small as an instant or sorcery that you get that trigger off of, you get that double spell, right? And then next turn swing again and get a second treasure and have both treasures, so now you can cast your big expensive spell like a Breach the Multiverse or whatever and copy that as well. So a lot of cool stuff you can do with this. I think it's really powerful. It does have a big downside in that it takes a total of 5 mana before this finally comes online for the first time, which is kind of a lot, but I think the power of it just makes up for that. I think it's just really strong. I'm excited to try using it, especially in decks where if you can just keep a very specific creature alive, you can just win the game. This could be pretty insane. Next up, we have 𝑇𝑒𝑟 Nation Vista. It enters the battlefield tapped. As it enters, you choose a color. You can tap it for a mana of the chosen color, or you can pay 1 and tap it, and for each color among monocolored permanents you control, you add 1 mana of that color. Now, some people are misunderstanding how this works as well. You don't get 1 mana for each monocolored permanent. You get 1 mana for each color represented by monocolor permanents on your battlefield. So, if you have any mono green at all, you'll add a mana. If you have any mono black at all, you'll add another mana. You'll get 2 for this, right? So, if you have 10 mono black permanents on the battlefield, you're still only going to get 1 mana for that. But if you have 1 mono black, 1 mono green, 1 mono white, you'll get 3. So make sure you keep your expectations in check. This is not, you know, a Nykthos. Why am I drawing a blank? I think it's Nykthos, right? This is not Nykthos. This is something else. Now, it's not going to be great in most decks. It's really hard to jump through those hoops and make that work, but there are a couple of decks specifically that can make good use of this. The most important one I think that comes to mind is Shrines. The Shrines decks are specifically trying to get out all of these monocolor enchantment shrines, and they're specifically trying to get 1 of each color anyway. Like, that's the goal of the deck. So this just slots into that perfectly. It's just only ever going to give you a little bit of extra mana to help you do the thing quicker. Not only that, but it can give you the Wooburg you need to maybe play the 5 mana shrine a little bit earlier than you otherwise might. So pretty cool for that. Also slivers. Slivers tends to use a lot of different monocolored slivers of all of the different 5 color slivers. 5 colors of slivers. So maybe you play this in a sliver deck and you're able to ramp out like your Sliver Queen or something extra early. That could be really cool too. But most of the ways people are thinking of wanting to use this when they first see it don't work. So don't get it confused with something like Nykthos. Here we have Tomb Trawler, 2 mana for a 0/4 artifact creature golem. You can pay 2 mana to put target card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. That's fine. This is going to be really good if you need to protect yourself from mill decks. There is a mill archetype in blue within this set. It is very scary, and this is a nice answer to that. So keep that in mind. Even if you just grab 1 or 2 of these super late in the draft and keep them in your sideboard in case you go up against that deck, it might be better than drafting a card that's not going to make the cut in your main deck, right? So keep that in mind. If you don't have a decent pick to grab, maybe grab a Tomb Trawler or 2, just in case you come up against that deck, because that deck's going to be real and it's going to be scary. Next up we have Torpor Orb. That's right, it is back. 2 mana for an artifact. Creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger. This is going to be super useful in Standard in sideboards, because some of the most important decks in the meta completely rely on ETB triggers. The Domain Ramp deck is relying on the ETB triggers of Atraxa and that one Angel with the double kicker. Shuts those down completely and makes that deck very manageable to deal with now. Also, Boros Convoke has a couple of really important ETB triggers that you shut down. So I think this card's going to be a really important sideboard card in Standard going forward. But that's really all it is. It's Torpor Orb. It's back. And the last card in colorless is Transmutation Font, a card that disappoints me. 5 mana for an artifact. You can tap it to make a blood token, clue token, or food token, whichever one you want. You can also pay 3 and tap it and sacrifice any 3 artifact tokens with different names to search your library for any artifact card, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle, but activate only as a sorcery. So I just think this is way too expensive. If this was 3 mana to play and 5 mana to activate, I think it would be a lot better. Being able to get this out earlier in the game on curve and start to accrue a different token every turn and build up a little value with it would make it so that first ability isn't quite as useless. But on a 5-drop, if all you can do is on turn 5 play this and make 1 blood token, that seems really bad. And then you have to pay you still have to pay a total of 8 mana to finally search up an artifact. And you also have to have the 3 different tokens to sacrifice. Even if you jump through all of the hoops to have the tokens ahead of time that you made with other cards, and you're not relying on the Transmutation Font to be out for 3 turns to make those tokens, which is kind of a big hoop to jump through to begin with, you still have to wait a whole turn and pay another 3 mana and sacrifice all 3 of those tokens so that you can't actually use them for anything. It's just a lot. It's a lot of hoops to jump through, and I just don't really like this card. I guess the one upside is that it's repeatedly able to tutor something straight onto the battlefield. So like the first thing you get, maybe you're not getting your mana's worth, or the permanents you have to sacrifice, maybe it's not quite worth it. But then if you get a second one the next turn, and then maybe even a third one the turn after that, then you just start to get overwhelming value by tutoring your best artifacts onto the battlefield every turn. So if there's a deck that could do something like that, maybe this would be useful, but I just feel like that's very difficult to do, and it's a lot of hoops to jump through. And I don't know, I just feel like this card is way too expensive and doesn't do enough quick enough to be worth it. But maybe I'm wrong. Let me know in the comments if I'm an idiot and there's something really crazy you thought of we could do with this card, because I'm sure the potential is there, but it just seems super overcosted. And this coming from someone who's usually very optimistic about all of the cards and always tries to find the ways in which they could be at their best. I just see this as very overcosted, and by the time it goes off, it's too little too late almost, even if it is able to tutor any artifact every turn straight onto the battlefield. And that's it. We're done with colorless. We made it through. My voice is almost gone, so I definitely need to stop and go to sleep, and then I'll get back at it in the morning. But thank you so much for checking out the video. If you haven't seen all of my other videos for the 5 colors, we already did white, blue, black, red, and green. I'm going to link those in the description down below. Please check them out. If you did already check them out and then you came here, I appreciate you greatly. Thank you for the support. Like the video if you haven't already, because I need your likes, damn it. They help this video get out to everybody else, and that's really important for helping the channel to grow. And also subscribe if you're new, because I got tons of content coming, tons of crazy deck ideas that I think are going to be super competitive. We're going to hit the ground running as soon as the set launches. I'm really excited about it. And then we've got one last set review coming for all of the multicolor cards after this, so stay tuned for that. I'm excited. I'll see you there. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.